parents are in a pretty good position to help improve their child's attendance, particularly their younger children who likely rely on them to get to school. But we found that parents, and particularly parents of younger students, have some consistent misbeliefs and lack some key information that actually might keep them from actively working to improve their child's attendance.
So hi everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Parenting Understood. Today we're thrilled to be talking with Dr. Robinson about her research and how it's applied in life. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Well, we're thrilled to talk about all the wonderful things that you do. But before we sort of jump into that, can you just talk a little bit about yourself and your journey to where you are today?
Sure. So I am an educational researcher, and I think it's pretty safe to say that most people who work in education or child development care about improving children's outcomes. So it's really not a big surprise that we focus a lot of our efforts on activities and interventions that target kids directly. But what I came to realize is that children are rarely developing and learning in isolation. As the saying goes, it takes a village to raise a child. And before getting into educational research, I was a teacher in New York City. And one thing that was really eye-opening for me was seeing the support students would receive from the different people in their lives and what that support looked like. And I think that really forms the foundation of my research and what I'm trying to learn, because I realized that the support that ended up being most effective didn't have to come from big gestures or extreme involvement. It could be the parent who made sure their kid was dropped off and picked up on time every day, or the former teacher who took the time to stop a kid in the hall to ask them how they were doing. So from what I could tell, these seemingly small actions could have disproportionately big impacts on kids' experiences. And so, coming back to the idea that it takes a village to raise a child, I became interested in understanding how we can make that village as effective as possible. So a question a lot of my research tries to answer is, how can we support the people who are making up children's villages? Because, in many cases, these are the people who are behind the scenes, helping kids make the most out of their educational experiences. And of all the people who make up a child's village, parents are going to be among their most ardent supporters who want the best for their child. But I think, as the conversations on this podcast so often suggest, it's not always clear what parents should be doing or how and when they should be doing it. I think this is especially true when we talk about parents engaging in their child's education, which is generally considered a good thing that we want and something we want parents to do. But it's also a pretty fuzzy concept that could encompass a really wide range of parenting behaviors. So my research often focuses on how schools and educators can more effectively partner with parents to improve student outcomes. In studying this, I've come to understand some of the more common barriers that might hinder parents from effectively supporting their child. And in the end, I'm really interested in actionable strategies. What do we want parents to do, and how can we help them do it? And so I really draw on social psychology and behavioral science to design interventions that activate effective support from children's supporters like parents to promote positive development, learning, well-being, and so on.
That's wonderful research. And, you touched on could you share with us what are some of the common barriers that come up between the parent and the teacher interaction? And are there differences depending on where your child is at in their education? So let's say like early education, preschool versus elementary versus secondary education and on.
Absolutely. And first, I think it's important we start this conversation, from a place where we agree that all parents want to help their children exceed, in education and in life. But despite some of the superhero feats required of moms and dads on a daily basis, I can confirm that parents are indeed human, and humans cannot do everything. And, even when they want to do something, they often face barriers that keep them from following through on even their, best intentions. So, for instance, parents might have incorrect or maladaptive beliefs about what is best for their kids, or Engaging in some education supporting behavior might be in conflict with another priority in their life. For instance, parents might have incorrect or maladaptive beliefs about what is best for their kids, or they may not be able to prioritize a certain education supporting behavior because it's in conflict with other things that they need to do. Or they might not know how to do what they're being asked to do. And so the research I do aims to identify important, but also achievable and developmentally appropriate behaviors parents can take to support their child's education, and then come up with strategies to help them follow through on those behaviors. And these strategies often focus on addressing the common barriers faced. And so I think it's helpful to think about what are some of the examples of these important, developmentally appropriate and achievable behaviors. It could involve a parent coming up with a strategy to make sure their kid is getting to school on time every day. It could be talking to your child about what they're learning in school and what they're doing to study for their upcoming test. Or it could help their child engage with a useful educational resource. These all seem like things that would fall under the things that engaged parents should be doing. But I think the parents listening might know all too well that these are just a few of the seemingly endless things parents need to pay attention to. So how do we get parents to mobilize and help their kids in the moment that it matters? And how does that differ by the age of their students? But I actually think that the actions parents need to take, while they might differ by the age of their child, they all have sort of common underlying features. And there are very specific things that parents need to engage in education promoting behaviors in a given moment. First, parents need to believe that their actions matter and will make a difference. We can call that parental efficacy. Second, parents need to know what to do, which requires having correct information to act upon. And finally, since we all have limited time, what it takes to support students needs to be actually doable or aligned with other priorities. And so me and, my too many collaborators to name really think about, trying to think about how to help parents follow through on their goals to engage in their child's education. And so I will give a concrete example of what I'm talking about for like a young child, and I'll pick a relatively uncontroversial outcome that we care about for students of all ages, or at least one that was uncontroversial before the pandemic. I think all bets are off about what is and what is not controversial now. But I think in general, most people would agree that it's very important that students attend school daily. And parents are in a pretty good position to help improve their child's attendance, particularly their younger children who likely rely on them to get to school. But we found that parents, and particularly parents of younger students, have some consistent misbeliefs and lack some key information that actually might keep them from actively working to improve their child's attendance. So first, parents often do not necessarily believe that missing a few days of school here and there can add up to negative consequences. And I can understand how that might not feel like a lot, but missing just one day of school a month would result in 2 weeks of lost learning time each school year. Particularly parents of students in younger grades often do not see the value in their student attending school every day. So that's a misbelief that needs to be addressed. I think related to this, parents often have no idea how many days of school their kid has missed. So let's say a student has missed an average of 20 days of school. When we ask parents how many absences they have, on average, they answer 10 days. So parents aren't comprehending the magnitude of the problem and therefore likely aren't motivated to act upon it. And this isn't particularly surprising or even parents' fault. It's actually really hard to keep track of absences, and parents aren't getting updated information on their kids' attendance records. So those are examples of the misbeliefs or barriers that parents face. And so with my research team, we developed and tested strategies that correct some of these misbeliefs. And specifically, we sent parents a series of personalized mailers over the course of the school year that highlighted the value of early schooling and daily attendance, and gave parents accurate information on how many days of school their child had missed to date that year. And this actually resulted in students being less absent and led to a 15% reduction in chronic absenteeism. And a survey of parents after the fact, we found that those who received the mailers were more accurate in estimating the number of days their child missed, and they're more likely to believe in the importance of regular daily attendance and how important that was for their child.
I think that's so interesting. It's just knowledge can do so much, right? Just having that knowledge. But I think you've brought up all these good points about also how parental engagement can look different than maybe sometimes we think of it as. And something that's, I don't know, resonated with me almost more as a parent than a researcher, but is sort of how often we define parental engagement, and sometimes feeling some anxiety around not being able to like meet that image of parental engagement, i.e. involvement at the school during the school day, which is hard, right, for working parents. So I'm just curious, sort of in your work, when you think about all the different ways that parental engagement, can be quantified and defined, how do you sort of yourself define it, sort of at its core? I think you've already sort of gotten at some of this. And then, how can we take some pressure off of parents to feel like we're doing the best we can with, engaging?
Yeah, I think you really hit the nail on the head. There's no definition for what good parent engagement should look like. When it comes to supporting your kids' education, you're supposed to have books around the house and read to your child. Make sure you're talking to them all the time too, and volunteer at school. But you know what? You better make sure your child has a quiet place to study too, and you can help them with their homework. And this doesn't even scratch the surface, right? And so, like, how is one or two or however many family members are in the house supporting a child that you're supposed to tackle all of these behaviors that a quote unquote good parent would be doing to help their child's education? And so, I think that the type of parental engagement that I'm looking at is in a way, low hanging fruit. What are the achievable, like I said, behaviors that parents are going to engage in and that might have an outsized impact on kids' outcomes? And so I think the best parent engagement are the things that our parents are actually going to do. So like, let's start there. And so, yeah, maybe you heard that parents that play music with their children have better outcomes, because for who knows why, because they're bonding, because instruments are important. But like, let's start first order. Do you play an instrument? Okay, no, that's not going to help you. So that's like, let's cross that one off the list. And you can have a list of all the things that you want to do, but in the end, it's what you actually can and are willing to do that matter. And I think a lot of the strategies that I develop and test are trying to think about what are the behaviors that parents actually want to engage in, and can we sort of help them get to a place where they can engage in those behaviors. So providing them with accurate information, or giving them the tools to have a conversation with their kid about school. So another study that I ran was sending parents of middle schoolers texts about what the student was learning in science class that day. And it included like a prompt, say like, okay, Erin's learning today about the body. Can you ask her to take your pulse? And so the idea was that you would really engage the parent and student in a meaningful conversation about science. And then we could look at, does that improve their outcomes? And we found that it did indeed increase the likelihood parents talk to students about science class. We found that students, shockingly actually liked it. They wanted more of it, which I think maybe is the biggest takeaway, but we didn't see an impact on students' science test scores. And we actually saw that by directing parents' behaviors towards this one thing, which was talking to their kid about science class, they were actually less likely to do other, behaviors that we might think are good parenting behaviors, like, well, for one, talking to their kid about other subjects, but also making sure that they go to sleep on time, or, they were less likely to turn off the TV. So I think when we think about parental engagement, wherever you're directing attention, you're necessarily directing attention away from other things that you could be doing. And so I think there's, you have to have a little grace, right? Like with yourself and knowing that you can't do anything and just trying to figure out what is potentially the most impactful and important thing you can do with your child.
The big things that I'm hearing and listening to you speak are, behavior tracking, right? Like, and that's true with anything that we're looking at. Like my husband and I were just having a discussion the other night about like, I'd like to like exercise just a little bit more. Like let's download this app and just track it, right? And like let's check in with each other, right? So we're holding each other accountable, but just the simple fact of tracking anything, which then led me to this idea of, some districts offer these systems, right? Like my district offers this system where you can kind of track. I think it's, even though we're in the system now and my kids are really young, like they're still preschool age, as they enter primary school and secondary school, I think there's more of an ability to track things like attendance, where you get to see the calendar, you get to see what are their assignments. And so are we seeing that happen more and more across, all schools? Just the simple idea of, hey, tracking is just one great intervention to know kind of this engagement, this educational engagement.
Yes, I think schools are definitely engaging in this type of, data collection and sharing it out with parents more. I also think that what's really key is that they're starting to share the information with parents at a moment at which like something parents can do something about it. And so there's been a lot of the time in prior years or, a decade ago, parents never learned about how many days their kid was absent until they got the report card, at the end of the semester. And so like, what are you going to do when you find out your kid was absent 10 days this past semester now? Like maybe, yeah, going forward, but you can't take action. And so I think it's not just the tracking of data, but it's communicating that data in easy to understand ways and actionable ways that makes it useful.
I think that's such a good point because even some of the research studies I've been on, right? Parents are provided with some great information about the intervention or whatnot, but long after, sometimes even their child is like the age at which you were sort of engaging with them around the intervention. So I think you bring up such a good point that research all along has to be maybe a little bit more, communicative with some of the folks that we're working with. And, I think another thing that's so great about your work is you're also thinking about the methodologies around what we do. And something that just sort of struck me that I'm curious to hear about is this idea of like the pre-registry and hypothesis testing. Because I think, well, if you can explain a little bit about that and sort of why, I think it's so important when we think about sort of moving science forward.
Yeah, so this idea of pre-registering hypothesis testing studies, which I'll describe in a second, falls under the broader umbrella of what people are now calling open science practices. And at the very core, I would say open science practices are tools that aim to increase the transparency, and ultimately the rigor of research. And the reason we care about increasing, the transparency and rigor of research is because in the end, we want people to actually use what was found in the research and for it to have an impact on society. But not all research is created equal, and we definitely should have more or less faith in the results that come from certain studies. And sort of the motivation for pre-registering studies is, I think you might hear about like the hot new study that grabs headlines. And we tend to hear about studies that have what we call statistically significant findings. And that means that the researchers conducted statistical analyses, and we can be pretty confident that the results would not be found just by chance alone. However, it turns out that the decisions you make in your research design and analyses, whether it be changing the outcome or splitting up the sample to look at subgroups, actually can have a pretty big consequence for whether the results turn out to be statistically significant or not. And because humans are very good storytellers, it's really easy to come up with a story after the fact about why the decisions that led to these just statistically significant results were the right ones. And so this is where this idea of pre-registering hypothesis testing studies comes in. So the idea is that researchers can publicly post exactly what their hypotheses are and exactly how they're going to evaluate each one before they have examined their data. And so this helps to limit the decisions that researchers have to make after seeing the results. So, the goal is that we can just have much more faith in a study's findings when they're pre-registered, and understanding that can, I think, help make people a better consumer of research. This is particularly helpful when it's like that new headline grabbing study with results that might be less likely to hold up over time. If it was pre-registered, we might have more faith that they actually might hold up over time.
I also kind of feel like it makes researchers almost like, or at least I'm speaking for myself here, I guess, but think almost more rigorously before you're doing it about, sort of what might be important to think about. So like you were saying, so often, right, subgroups, maybe an intervention is more or less effective for certain groups, and really thinking about that before engaging in their intervention, I feel like is very helpful as well in terms of even just a cost sort of benefit analysis right from the start. So I love this idea that, that you're really promoting this open science and pre-registry.
Yeah, I think the theory of change piece really comes into play, because if you're going to be like really publicly posting what you think is going to happen, you need to have some sort of idea about why you think that's going to happen. And so it really makes you think through those key decisions before you run the study, which is always a good idea, but sometimes happens less than you think. And you might realize it might help you realize that you really want to change this key outcome, but actually how you've designed the study, that might not happen. Or you might think it's only going to happen for a subgroup of students, for instance.
Yeah, it's so interesting to think these things through. So sort of, you've come, so you're a researcher, you've been a teacher, you're a parent. So how do you find, all these sort of roles have influenced, particularly your parenting, but just also, sort of each other as you've thought about sort of the different avenues your work has taken as well?
Yeah, it's been interesting. I'm a recent parent. I have two little boys under 3 at home. And so but I was doing parental engagement research long before I had kids. And so it definitely, helps you take a different perspective. We think about the behaviors that we should be engaging in. I know that my child is supposed to have a well-balanced dinner with all the different food groups. But, in practice, when he eats the dinner roll and that's it, and is screaming, this is not the hill I'm going to die on today. And so I'm not following through with my best intentions as a parent. And I realize how hard that can be in the moment. So I think I definitely have a better perspective on, why parents might not be following through on these behaviors that we think, really can make a big difference in the lives of their kids. And I personally am really interested in, as I sort of led off with, this idea about the supporters in a child's village. And so having been a teacher, being a researcher, now being a parent, I'm really interested in thinking about how these different people can partner with one another to promote positive development and outcomes for the child. And so, as a parent or a teacher, who are the key supporters in a child's village? And can parents and teachers and other members partner together? I don't think schools and teachers always do a good job in inviting parents to engage in their children's education, but most educators believe that parents should be proactively reaching out about their child. So while I think schools should do a better job communicating this and inviting parents in, don't wait for an invitation to ask what you can be doing from a teacher or from a school. And I think relatedly, I'm also interested in how parents and teachers can think about how they partner with the kid themselves. I always tell schools to take an asset-based view of parents and invite them to engage in their kids' education. Well, parents, take an asset-based view of your kids and invite them to engage in their own education with you. Give them choices. And I realize this is easier said than done, but figuring out ways to have deeper conversations with your kids about what they're learning in school, or helping navigate what resources are offered that your child may be able to use. Those are actionable things that can be done in partnership, with, again, developmentally appropriate comes into play, a slightly older child.
As the mom of a 13-year-old, I definitely appreciate that. Because I also think, excuse me, getting back to like a little bit of the study that you did with the text messaging is that there is that, they're not as open and they're not as, I don't know. I mean, I find at least when, she comes home, I used to hear all about her school day and I don't anymore. Like I wish I did, but I don't. And sometimes it would be nice to get a little bit more from the school, just so like have a background on sort of what's going on in your child's life. I think it's easy to assume that kids are coming home with that information, but I think especially as kids get older, sometimes that assumption might not be fully fully true.
Yeah, I think the motivation stemmed from that like classic conversation with like how was your day? Good. What happened at school today? Nothing much. Yeah.
Like, really? I haven't seen you from 7:30 to like 4:30 and nothing happened your whole day. That's amazing.
Yeah. I think you have to get creative with your questioning, right? Like, even with my preschooler, I'm like, what made you laugh today? And then I get like this whole story. And I'm like, that's amazing.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, that's probably a little more interesting than also like, can you take my pulse? Like we were doing with the science conversational prompts. But, take the conversations where you can get them, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Totally. Well, so I know folks are going to want to hear more about your work and also, for their own, I think, benefit. We all want to think about how we can better engage with our kids often. So where's the best place to find information about yourself and your research?
Yeah, so I have a website. It's carlydrobinson.com. And I'm also on Twitter. It's more of a passive actor on Twitter, but I'm intending to be more engaged, but I haven't quite followed through on my intentions yet. I'm not sure what the barriers are there, but it's at Carly__Robinson. But I would love to engage in this. I love talking about it. So hearing questions or ideas is always welcome.
Great. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. This was really fun.